Hey, it's Jim, and this is level 1 of the CFA program, the topic on economics and the learning module on fiscal policy. We just completed a learning module on the business cycle, so it makes sense then to ask the follow-up question. And that is, how does the government influence the business cycle? And of course, part of that answer is through fiscal policy, and then our next learning module will be on monetary policy. So I want you to think of fiscal and monetary policy as complementary macroeconomic tools. Now, this is a relatively short learning module, and so I'm going to try to get you out of here in a record short time period, but I want to make sure that we cover all of these LOSs. We'll do lots of comparing, and in fact, that first LOS, it shows up not in that exact verbiage, but in a similar verbiage in the monetary policy LOS. Roles and objectives, that shows up in the monetary policy as well. Advantages and disadvantage as well. But look down at the fourth one. This is the one that I think is really a great exam question. We talked about the business cycle, expansions and contractions. Remember, we had that little graph that looked like that. And so the great questions inside of both monetary and fiscal policy learning modules are, all right, here's the government. It's going to execute this monetary policy or this fiscal policy. Will that tend to expand the economy, or will that tend to contract the economy? You guys that listen to me regularly know that I'm a big fan of linking LOSs from different topics and different learning modules. So let's start out with just a comparison here. What do we know about monetary policy? Central banks are in charge of monetary policy. Central banks have several macroeconomic tools available. Central banks can set interest rates. Here in the United States, the Fed can set the discount rate. It can set the Fed funds rate. It could probably set Jim's interest rate if it wanted to. It can also go into the open market to buy or sell Treasury securities. We'll talk about Treasury securities in another learning module. Central banks also require financial institutions to keep cash on hand. These are called reserve requirements. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, boils down to just two things. What does our Treasury Department here in the United States do? It taxes and it spends. And if there's an equal sign between the S and the T, that's called a balanced budget. We haven't had a balanced budget in the United States for quite some time. We had a little surplus at the very end of the Bill Clinton years, but during my 62 years of life, we haven't had too many surpluses. So what has to happen then? Now, we had a different learning module on federal government debt. So we talked at length about Treasury bills and Treasury notes and Treasury bonds. So when the government spending exceeds its taxing, then it has to borrow in the capital markets. So that national debt or the federal debt must be a component of our discussion about fiscal policy. So here we are comparing in this LOS. So look down at the bottom red, macro tools geared towards, well, let's take a step back and think, if we were in charge of the economy, what would we like to see as some of the characteristics of that economy? Well, we'd like to see everybody who wants a job has a job. Everybody who wants a job has a job, and it's a good paying job. Everybody that is working then is generating an income so they can support their families and they can support the economy. So we like stability in the employment market. We also would like economic growth. We'd like to make $100 this year, and then next year we'd like to make $107 or $112 or whatever it is. So both monetary and fiscal policy have to be geared towards some kind of sustainable growth. Embedded in that conversation, I've got to do this here in the 2020s, we need to mention inflation. It's the goal of both of these groups of government entities, but of course it falls mostly on the central bank to kind of set some target inflation rate. In 2022, the inflation was around 9% at some point, which was not quite the Fed's target. All right, so look at the circle points there. Yeah, monetary policy implemented by central banks. Fiscal policy is implemented by the congressmen and congresswomen who pass laws. Similarities, both macro tools, government policies attain economic stability and growth. All right, so how about the differences between monetary policies and fiscal policies? So, central bankers, governments, policymakers. So there's that first diamond point. I said that already. But the monetary policies include things like open market operations, reserve ratios, maybe credit controls. Go back to the 2008 financial crisis. After that, we had this Dodd-Frank law that passed that was aimed at preventing another kind of, what was the cause of the 2008 financial crisis? Well, this is not a conversation for today, but I'll just go ahead and say, well, this and this and this and this and this. But one of those causes was lack of, or at least a perceived lack of, capital adequacy ratios in the financial institution industry, so we can have selected credit controls. I mean, the Fed could wake up today and say, you know what, I would like for any bank that makes a loan to a homeowner to require 90% down payment. There we go. Selective credit controls. Now, of course, if the Fed did that, there would be no new housing construction, and probably anarchy would result. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, is the taxing, and that probably is not a great time to have a conversation about the IRS, but the IRS is our collecting agency here in the United States, so we need to make sure that we collect and enforce the laws and regulations that are passed by Congress. But then what the Treasury does is decide on where we're going to spend it. Of course, that's through congressional decisions, and whoever is president and vice president of the United States, they have a gigantic say in how much money we spend. So primary goal of fiscal policy is to, let's take a step back. What are we doing here? Take a look and see the economy. We want our private sector to produce as much as possible, right? So we want to influence that GDP through government decisions on taxing and spending. So we need to have a conversation on aggregate demand. So what does that mean? You and I are all part of aggregate demand. What do? Well, we go out and we buy food. We go out and we fill up our cars with gas or electricity. We go to the mall and buy clothes. We buy houses. We do all sorts of stuff. But then businesses also demand. Of course, businesses, they have a supply chain on this side and a supply chain on that side. So that reflects all of that demand. So if you lump all that together, you get aggregate demand. So how can we boost? And this is going to be a great exam question. How can fiscal policy boost overall demand? Well, maybe we can reduce tax rates, both at the personal income tax level and the corporate tax level. This was a huge deal when Donald Trump was running for president. He said that the U.S.'s 35% corporate tax rate was totally out of comparison to other countries' corporate tax rates, and he was exactly correct. And when he was running for president, he said things like, you know what, I think I'll lower it to maybe 15%, maybe 18%. But when he was elected president, somehow we ended up with 21%, which was still a reduction. So what's that first part here? Boosted by lowering taxes, all different sorts of taxes. In a few minutes, we'll have a slide that has the value added tax on there. I'll go ahead and say, let's go ahead and not even think about putting that in so that we don't have to lower it. How's that for Jim's editorialization for the day? But then look at that second bullet point there, introducing new public expenditures for all sorts of projects. And this is important. I want you guys to think about this, especially those of you who live in Maryland or Virginia. There's a Chesapeake Bay Bridge, that goes somewhere around Annapolis. But if you look, there are no other bridges until you get all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean. So imagine the federal government saying, you know what, we need another bridge, maybe on the border of the Maryland-Virginia geography. And what that will do is it will boost overall demand by maybe making crabbing a better and more efficient industry. Have you guys ever had the Maryland blue crab? Oh my gosh, for those of you who hadn't, you're missing out on a super delicacy. But think about this. So you've got the government comes in and spends, however much it would cost. Maybe it takes 5 years And so what happens? You hire lots of construction workers. You have to pay for the concrete. You have to pay for the lumber. You have to pay for the engineers and the scientists. And you have to have all sorts of other people out there getting involved to make sure that we're not going to damage the crab population and any other animal or fish population that lives around there. And then it takes 5 years. So the income in that area has been dramatically impacted. So what does that do? That helps socially in that area by raising incomes. The question, and we'll talk about this in a later LOS, is, how do you reconcile those 5 years worth of expenditures through, let's say, a 10 or a 20-year long-term trend in growth? And so clearly politicians are wanting to pursue projects that are going to have those short-term effects, but also have an impact so that it creates a scenario under which that long-term growth is sustainable. You've heard me use that term sustainable many, many times. Now, there are, two kinds of polar views about government spending. The Keynesians, they say things like, yes, when the government spends, what it will do is it will increase aggregate demand, it will increase economic output, it will reduce unemployment, and it will have all sorts of great short-term and long-term impacts. All right, so that sounds good. Monetarists, on the other hand, they say that is just short-term. And I'll give you a quick example here. Is that you're probably aware, especially of those of you who are sports fans, that there are lots of cities throughout the world, not just in the United States, that spend, well, let's just be honest with each other, billions of dollars on sports stadiums. And the local politicians always say, oh, this is going to be great for economic growth. We're going to raise the living standard for all the people that live here and work here, not just this year, but for the next 1,000 years. But there are lots and lots of economic studies that show that is just a temporary effect. Now, I'm not equating that to federal spending, but I'm saying we need to take a step back and be really careful. And I think this is a really good exam question that asks you about the difference between short-term and long-term impacts on aggregate demand. Now, let's talk about this concept of these stabilizing factors that tend to be automatic. The term automatic sounds an awful lot like, we don't need to worry about them. They're just going to automatically come into play. And some of them do, and some of them need some kind of a trigger. But suppose that we have an economic slowdown. What happens then if we have a recession is that individuals, they tend to lose their jobs, or at least they tend to lose some of their hours. So their income falls. But then what happens? This automatic stabilizer is that unemployment insurance kicks in and compensates these individuals who have lost their income or who have experienced reductions in their income. And so what that does, that unemployment compensation, those unemployment benefits, they will then boost aggregate demand. Now, suppose on the other hand, we have these expanding economies, so everybody's working and everybody's making tons and tons of money. And what are they doing? They are going to spend all that extra money, but they're also going to bump themselves up into a higher tax rate. And so they'll pay higher taxes, and so the government will tend to raise more in tax revenues, which will then reduce the budget deficit and have implications for all other sorts of things in the economy. So look at those bottom bullet points there. They're built into the tax and the transfer system. Here we go, national debt. This is what I was saying earlier. Of course, if we spend too much, then we're going to have to borrow. So governments borrow all the time. In the 2020s, the current level of total U.S. federal debt is in the 30s of trillions of dollars. I don't have any idea how many zeros that is. I've been warning my students for a long, long time, going back to probably the second George Bush presidency. No, even before that, the first George Bush presidency, saying, boy, we need to worry about these total debt But nobody really seems to listen to me, and no one really seems to care a whole lot about it these days. So maybe it doesn't matter. I don't know. But how can we determine the solvency of a country? You might be aware that there have been 2 ratings agencies that have lowered the U.S. Treasury security debt, for relatively short time periods to less than its best rating. And so how do we do this? We want to evaluate the solvency of a country. So we look at ratios. Debt to GDP, the ratio of interest payments to GDP. So think about this. We've had great conversations about the right-hand side of the balance sheet for corporations. And what do we know? There's a tax advantage of issuing bonds for corporations, but there's also a bankruptcy cost of issuing bonds for corporations. And so corporations try to find some optimal level of debt. Well, governments ought to pursue something like that, but you'd have to take a step back and you'd have to rearrange the balance sheet and to try to figure out what does an optimal level of debt for a country mean, because the benefits of national debt are completely difficult to quantify, especially over the long term. So notice what word we put in there. Look at that second block point. If that debt to GDP ratio, like 100%, if it reaches unsustainable levels, what that means then is that the economy is probably going to go into some type of a recession. What do we have at the bottom there? Cause for concern. All right, how about some arguments opposing that national debt matters? So I've always said to my students that it matters, but maybe it doesn't, right? Why doesn't it? Well, the Treasury Department, most of it is owed to individuals and financial institutions and other institutions inside of the United States. Which means that the government could say to us, suppose I own $100,000 in Treasury notes and the government can't pay me back. They would say, you know what, Jim, be a good citizen. Don't require us to pay you back now. We'll pay you some other time, So there probably would be some kind of a delay in the payment if we ever reached that point. How about this? That example of the bridge from Virginia over to Maryland across the Chesapeake Bay, that's a productive investment. Maybe after 10 years, we've got tremendous crabbing industries on both sides, the East Shore and the West Shore. People come down from Delaware. You guys know this, the geography. They come down from Philadelphia. They come down from New York City. And it's an easy way for them to get to Virginia. Maybe not an easy way, but maybe it's a quicker way than having to drive through Washington, right? So productive investments, if people are spending less time sitting in traffic, and if you've ever driven across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, you'll know about traffic. Now, if we have substantial fiscal deficits, we probably need some kind of tax reform. We've been hearing about that. And I say this to my students. I say, during your lifetime, right, these kids are, they're around 20 years old. So I say, look, during your lifetime, we've had nothing but deficits. And we've heard about tax reform. And we hear tax reform from Republicans, and we hear tax reform from Democrats. We need to take a step back and say, you know what, let's forget about the politics of this. Let's figure out what tax reform is efficient. Now, remember Modigliani and Miller in our capital structure conversation, they told us that the capital structure on the right-hand side of the balance sheet, whether a firm issues debt or equity, is irrelevant in determining the value of the company. Well, there's this thing called the Ricardian equivalence that has a similar kind of an impact, a similar kind of a thought process that says something like the private sector is there to counterbalance any kind of bond issue that the government has to use by adjusting their behavior. And what the reading emphasizes is boosting their savings in the idea that taxes are going to rise in the future. Now, the reading is very clear. It says something like, it's really difficult to measure whether this Ricardian equivalence is accurate or worthwhile or even useful, but I would just know the definition for the exam. Look down at the bottom there. Debt could potentially be linked to a rise in employment for a number of reasons, but linking back to financing productive investments. Now, this could be called Jim's arguments supporting that national debt matters and that none of his students have been listening to him for the last 30-some years. Yeah, the idea is that as soon as we get to some approachingly unsustainable ratio, debt to GDP, then sooner or later we're going to have increases in tax rates. And what did we say earlier? If the government wants to expand the economy, it should lower tax rates. So this goes against this. So lots and lots of debt is counter growth. It necessarily, at least in my mind, leads to too many recessions. I guess one is too many recessions. There are some governments out there that just print money, crowding out. This is an important concept. Since the government is borrowing so much money and using up so much of this capital, it crowds out the public sector. And so let's say a company like Procter & Gamble, they have an idea for a new product line and they go to the market and all of the bondholders say, oh no, we're not going to lend to you. We're going to lend to the government because they're risk-free and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the crowding out effect. What that does then is it probably elevates interest rates. If governments do two things, spending and taxing, let's go ahead and look at both of these as tools, describe tools. So what are the spending tools? Capital expenditures, current spending, and transfer payments. If you pay any attention to stuff that comes out of Washington, you'll learn that lots and lots of transfer payments, these are embedded into the code. And so there's really no discretion in terms of congressmen and congresswomen decision making, but then expenditures, both current and long term, those are. So why do our congressmen and women do this? Essential services like defense spending, which protects our borders, infrastructure spending. We did this with the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, income and wealth distribution. Of course, you have individuals and families at the lower end of the economic scale, and we have an obligation to make certain that those individuals and families, that they have enough food and housing and clothing and all that kind of good stuff. What do we like? Economic objectives. I said this earlier. We like low inflation. We like stable inflation. We like high employment. And we like lots and lots of growth. And then subsidized innovation. This holds true in our long history in the United States, where the government puts together components of the tax code that will promote investment in certain industries, maybe like solar power. Now, on the revenue side here, we just did spending on the revenue side. So we have these direct taxes. So think about April 15th. We pay individual income tax. Corporations pay their taxes, but they typically do it on a quarterly basis. We can even tax wealth, although that has been floated by some congressmen and women. Look up at the top, indirect taxes. There's the value added tax. I'll just let you remind yourselves what I said about that earlier. But that's an indirect tax. So that's probably a good exam question, the difference between direct and indirect. What are some desirable qualities of a tax policy? Simplicity, that makes sense. Efficiency, that makes sense. Fairness, that makes sense. To generate adequate revenue, that makes perfect sense. You hear politicians say this all the time. We need a simple tax code. Well, the tax code here in the United States is probably not too simple. I know that when my father passed away, and my mother had already passed away, my dad had a whole bunch of stuff in there, and my sister and I, we had to hire a specialized accountant. And my father was not a wealthy man by any stretch of the imagination, but somehow in there we had to do some extra stuff that amounted to just several hundreds of dollars in an extra tax liability. So my father left us with an extra tax liability. That's how much he loved us. That was through no fault of his own, by the way. And let me go ahead and give a personal note. I miss my mom and dad terribly. If your mom and dad are alive right now, I want you to get out your phone and text them. I want you to say, I love you. Fairness, of course, the tax code should be fair in terms of if you are generating more income, then you ought to pay more in dollar amounts of taxes. And that's probably pretty true throughout the world. And then adequate revenue. Of course, we need to be able to raise adequate revenue for all of these things here. So what do? As a voting citizenship, we elect congressmen and women that are going to promote these kinds of things. And then we say, you know what, come up with a model so that you can do all that stuff. Yeah, what are the problems here? Incentives. Income taxes reduce the motivation to work. This is one of the criticism of the Trump and then the Biden presidency during and after COVID, where the government, they extended these unemployment benefits, they extended all these other kinds of benefits. And so a lot of people just said, you know what, I don't really need to work. I can make more money without working. So the incentives, and then that, of course, brings in this concept of fairness. Now, I always question this, let's go ahead and have a universal definition of fairness. Let's not move the goalposts over time. Now, what does tax reform mean? Should inflation be all part of this? Should we say something like, all right, you do this, and then let's add inflation, whatever that rate of inflation, the CPI is. Boy, this is huge conversations in Washington about that. How about this next one? Should all investments be deductible for corporate taxes? Of course. What do corporations deduct on their income statement? They have a depreciation expense. They have a depletion expense. They have an amortization expense. These are non-cash expenses that reduce the tax liability. So you ought to say to yourselves, well, why would the government allow corporations to reduce their tax liability? Isn't the goal to raise as much taxes? But the idea is that without that non-cash expense, then those individual corporations, they wouldn't hire anybody. So all the people that work for them, they probably pay more in income taxes than is deducted on the corporate income statement. Now, how about advantages and disadvantages? No, we have indirect taxes. They can be quickly adjusted. Direct taxes, these have to go through the whole congressional approval and vote. Not saying anything about when these changes are made, then you have businesses who have to deduct these on the payroll. And I know at my institution, every once in a while we have problems with issues over in the payroll department. Social policies can be adjusted. We can go ahead and impose consumption taxes. Do yourself a little favor. Type in Philadelphia soda tax. This is about 6 or 7 years old by now, and see what the consequences are of that Philadelphia soda tax. All right, how about a fiscal stance and the deficit? So what we're trying to do is get a sense, just like we do all of this Fed watching. Now, we'll talk a bit about this in the monetary policy learning module. We've got lots and lots of really smart economists who stand by and they watch every word. They listen to every sentence. They look at the Fed chairman's, does he or she raise his eyebrows when they talk? Do they flare their nostrils when they talk? Do you remember that Seinfeld episode where Jerry touches his chin and then it's his? He goes like this. We do Fed watching. So fiscal stance is the analogous counterpart over for congressmen and congresswomen about this idea about what the government believes is the appropriate level of spending and taxing, and then, of course, the budget deficit. So we can interpret, we can view and observe this fiscal stance through these automatic and discretionary fiscal adjustments. These things are used to stabilize this aggregate demand. Notice we have that in bolded there, and that's probably super important. Now, this is what we know. We know that the deficit, that sometimes it goes like this, sometimes it goes like this, and it depends on things like seasonality. It depends on things like intentions of current taxes versus future taxes, but there are some automatic stabilizers in there that help reduce fluctuations in the deficit size. There's this thing called a structural deficit. Suppose that we computed the deficit if the economy was operating at full employment, or if corporations and businesses were operating at full potential, that would be a structural budget deficit, and that's an indication of what that fiscal stance might be. Look down at the bottom. We need to worry about the difference between real interest rates and nominal interest rates. We had a great conversation about this back in our time value of money conversation. So what do we know? If we own a fixed rate bond like a treasury bond and it's paying us a fixed coupon payment every year, let's say $100 that we get every year, well, our $100, if there is inflation, we can buy a certain amount of goods today with $100, but next year when we get that fixed payment of $100, if inflation is 5 or 10 or 20%, then that $100 doesn't go as far. So make sure you get the difference between real and nominal. Now, economists talk about this all the time. Whenever there is a decision, there's probably some kind of a lag. So common difficulties in implementing fiscal policies. There's a recognition lag, there is an action lag, and there is an impact lag. And note that those lags, they're real, but they're also complexified by the uncertainty about the economic future. Other economic issues, I think we mentioned many of these here. Crowding out, I said that. Inflation and unemployment, budget deficits. Are they already large relative to GDP? That's why I use that term, sustainable. We have data issues. We talk about this at length in level 1 and level 2 and level 3. We have data, but is it accurate? Is it complete? Measuring the level of full employment, this is challenging. You can't go out and just ask every 62-year-old dude like me, hey, do you have a job? And if the answer is no, do you want to have a job? That's difficult. All right, so let's go over this last one here. This is super important. I think these are the bulk of the questions that you might be faced with. All right, so think about the business cycle. We've got the trough. We're coming out of the trough, and here we are. We're looking for the expansion, right? Recovery into that maturing stage. So what do we want to do? We can increase government spending. We can have tax cuts. We can increase transfer payments. We can decrease interest rates. Those are expansionary policies. If we want to contract, right, if the economy is overheating, we can do just the opposite. Decrease government spending, increase taxes, decrease transfer payments, and increase interest rates. So the cool thing, from a test-taking standpoint, is that these are opposites. So just remember one, and then you can remember the other. But I'm going to go ahead and advise you to get out your phone and take a picture of this slide. And that takes us through those 4 LOSs. Hey, let's go ahead and be super excited about our learning module on monetary policy. So what I want you to do is go to the end of this learning module. There are just a handful of questions on there. They're all definitional, and I'm pretty sure you can answer those in less than 5 minutes. Hey, thanks for watching, and good luck studying.